Jakob von Uexküll was born in Estonia in 1864, that is 150 years ago. He graduated Tartu University and became an eminent biologist who has influenced the understanding of life far beyond his own discipline. His main contribution was to work out the scientific approach to the worlds of other species, to the animal meaning-making. As a pioneer of biosemiotics, he is also seen as one of classics in animal behavior studies, comparative psychology, biocybernetics, philosophy of biology, theoretical biology, and general semiotics. He worked in several places in Heidelberg, in Naples, in Hamburg. He established the Institute of Umweltforschung, Umwelt research. His last years were spent in island Capri, where he died in 1944. Our work with his legacy has already some history. In 1977, for instance, we had a conference on the theory of organism dedicated to Jakob von Uexküll. In 1989, a meeting on Uexküll in Tartu took place, in which several members of his family participated, including professor in medical semiotics, Ture von Uexküll, and his grandson, Jakob von Uexküll, who established the Right Livelihood Award. In 1999, we held an international symposium, Uexküll and Living Environment, with Thomas Sebeok among participants. And in 2004, a symposium, Kassirer, Lottmann, Uexküll, between biology and semiotics of culture. Now I have a honor to introduce our guest. Wendy Wheeler is professor of English Literature and Cultural Inquiry at London Metropolitan University and a visiting professor in the Environmental Humanities and the Arts of the University of Oregon in USA and Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia. She's the author of books New Modernity, Change in Science, Literature and Politics from 1999, and The Whole Creature, Complexity, Biosemiotics and the Evolution of Culture from 2006. On this book, Jesper Hofmeyr says, "What a pleasure to read this book, which integrates biosemiotics into a wider argument about the material basis for human society." She shows that the complex structures of biosemiotic evolution have always involved the creativity, which is born from the difficult but productive phenomenological encounter between the self and the others. Wendy Wheeler has been an editor, jointly with Jeremy Gilbert, of New Formations, a journal of culture theory politics. She edited special issues for this journal on eco-criticism and animal studies, and also special issue for Green Letters on ecophenomenology and practices of the sacred. She has also edited the Living Book on Biosemiotics. We first met in 2005 in London Metropolitan University, where Paul Cobley organized a small symposium on biosemiotics, and later several times again. A year ago, she organized a wonderful conference on biosemiotics and culture in Eugene, Oregon, USA. And currently, she's completing a new book, The Flame and Its Shadow, Reflections on Nature and Culture from a Biosemiotic Perspective. Thank you very much for accepting our proposal to deliver the first Jakob von Uexküll lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kalevi. I just hope I'm not going to take ages getting this PowerPoint to work. I should say that meeting with Kalevi and Jesper and Søren Bria and Fredrik Stjernfeldt in 2005, it was 2005, the beginning of 2005, was like an explosion going off in my head when I found out about biosemiotics. I think, help. Can everybody hear me okay? Could you hear me before? Good. I think there's a quiet revolution going on, you see, in how we think about things. It's not coming up. It's coming up. That's quite exciting. There they are. We've all got the same pictures. Charles Sand's purse looks a bit like a little person next to. Well, he certainly really is, metaphysically speaking. But I thought I'd start off with these interesting quotes, which I'll read in a minute. Biosemiotics has a sort of revolution going on in the way we think about material life as communicative. But I note that John Dealey, who is an American philosopher of semiotics, dedicated one of his books, I'm not actually sure which one it is, Kalevi might know, to the semioticians of the 22nd century, because that's how long he thinks the revolution will take. It's not only a revolution in how we think about living creatures, that they have rich communicative lives, right down to the cell, but it has a sort of inescapably immaterial dimension too, which I'm equally interested in. And both those things together, I think, what make it revolutionary. Why does it have, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, why does it have an immaterial dimension? Because it's concerned with semiotic relations. It's concerned with relations, as was Whitehead's philosophy. It's a process biology. And relations are not material things. You know, we're in a relationship. Those bottles are in a relationship to each other. But if I ask you to pick up and measure the relationship in a scientific way, the relationship between the bottles or between us, you can give me, signs of a relationship. But if I ask you to pick up and measure the relationship itself, you can't, because it's not material. It's what Bateson calls a no thing. So that's why I think it's a revolutionary thing. And I thought that I would put up these three quotes. The first is from Whitehead, who I know that some of you are familiar with. And I particularly like this quote because of the emphasis on evolution, because it's evolution that grounds biosemiotics and semiotics generally as a kind of realism, but it's a realism in which materialism and immaterialism are inextricably linked. I mean, what people would say, and what Dealey argues again and again, is that it just does away with that idealism, realism distinction. So Whitehead, a thoroughgoing evolutionary philosophy, is inconsistent with materialism. The aboriginal stuff or material from which a materialist philosophy starts is incapable of evolution. This material is in itself the ultimate substance. Evolution on a materialistic theory is reduced to the role of being another word for the description of the changes of the external relations between portions of matter. Peirce, cynicism, i.e. universal continuity, the continuity of things, the relatedness of things, is opposed to dualism, the philosophy which performs its analyses with an axe, leaving as the ultimate elements unrelated chunks of being. And here's the biologist Richard Lewontin being remarkably frank about materialism. I note, incidentally, that Thomas Nagel quotes this exact quote in his recent book, Mind and Cosmos. Have any of you come across it, read it? I recommend it. He's just saying, we just can't go on pretending that we can just talk about materialism because there are so many things it can't answer, not least the question of mind. But we can think of that as a question of relations too. So here's what Lewontin says in this review of Carl Sagan or Sagan's Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. It's as if there's an assumption that taking immaterial things, immaterial relations, which we all do all the time, seriously, and semiotic causation, semiotic causes, seriously, commits us to believing in God, which of course, a transcendental God, of course it doesn't. But clearly, if you think about science historically, that's what's going on. I'm very, very honoured indeed to be giving this, to have been asked to give this Jakob von Uexküll lecture here at Tartu, which has been for so long a centre of original and creative thought, and to be introduced by the world's first professor of biosemiotics, Kalevi Kull. Let me tell you where I'm going. Kalevi, can I ask you, just in case I forget to look at my watch, can you tell me when I've got 10 minutes or something to go? Yes, there's a big watch there, but I can't see it. Fortunately, you're all a blur. So the paper is divided into 3 sections. The first part discusses the von Uexküllian Umwelt- and Funktionskreis. The second part of it discusses Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic and the growth of signs and meanings. Signs evolve, in other words, they grow, they're like living things, and Peirce makes that point. And the last explores, and I hope I'll get to it, the biosemiotic idea of poiesis, which is what I'm trying to work on, and what I discovered yesterday, other people are trying to work on too. How can we, for this audience in particular, and for my own, Asley at home, we want to be able to think about how these ideas can work in terms of our thinking about literature. So I'm going to try and offer at least the beginnings of some thinking about how that might work. Okay. When we talk about framing nature, we must, of course, ask who or what is doing the framing. Are we framing nature, or is nature perhaps framing us? And if the latter is the case, which aspect of nature might be doing the framing? Or should we perhaps talk about a mutual framing, an ongoing and growing dance of complexity, in which the frames are themselves made of a constantly shifting series of focuses and a growing evolutionary frame? Can we think of this dance of shifting focuses like movements of attention, periods of dreamlike habit, punctuated with intense experience of differences, developing at different levels and in different places? Perhaps we can think of it as, for example, like a film or video camera's shifts from interior intimacy to exterior distance, from wide panning shot to tight close-up. What I mean to convey here is a cybersemiotic dance of all the organisms, which is framing itself, and in which that framing is a matter of perspective and subject position. This is framing as autopoiesis, and more specifically, evolutionary life as a self-reading text in which meanings are constantly growing. So, the von Uexküllian conception of Umwelt. I know that some of you, when I was thinking about this paper, I found it's quite difficult to know exactly where to pitch it, because I know some of you will know about this, but I'm fairly sure that others won't. So I thought I'd do a kind of sort of relatively brief run through. It's important to understand about von Uexküll, but as Kalevi said, very, very important part of he's been a very important part of our biosemiotic understandings, and also, of course, of other philosophical reflections by Heidegger and Agamben, and somebody said yesterday, Lacan. I haven't come across that. Maybe I just didn't notice it. When I read Lacan, I say read, I use the word loosely, puzzled over when I was a postgrad. Okay, in von Uexküll's usage, Umwelt doesn't mean simply environment or surround in a sort of general sense, but rather signifying environment. As is well known, one of the simplest worlds invoked by von Uexküll is the Umwelt of a species of tick, which has only 3 signs in it. I'm going to skip over that because I want to get to the end. But it's a well-known example, and I think it's probably on the von Umwelt Wikipedia page. In fact, the little world of the tick, which only has 3 signs in it. Every species sees. I'm using that to stand in for or otherwise senses. I mean, we privilege sight. So when I use sees in this sense, it's standing in for otherwise senses. Only the signifying world, which constitutes its own species-specific carriers of meaning or signs. And of course, this includes human animals, although with us, we'll have to add further, much more complex levels of semiosis. In the case of Umwelten, then, certainly in one sense, the framer is evolution. Every species sees, or otherwise senses, what evolutionary pressures have sculpted it to see or otherwise sense in terms of survival and reproduction. But in naming the framing force evolution, I'm not by any means invoking either a simple neo-Darwinian story of random genetic mutation and natural selection, or indeed a passive organism. I suppose that natural selection must be always a sculpting force of some significance, although I note that some biologists have written papers giving accounts of evolution without natural selection, and I'm fairly sure that Kalevi is one of them. Natural selection can sculpt and refine what exists, but I don't think it can explain speciation. Darwin's model is a breeder's model, isn't it? No breeder is going to manage to turn a pig into a bird, for example. So there's a question of form, and that's why there's an increasing emphasis on development as explaining evolution. Developmental processes as explaining evolution, rather than the other way around, or evolutionary theory ignoring developmental processes altogether. So when we come to highly complex things such as cultures, the questions surrounding the applicability of Spencer's and then Darwin's idea of the production of the fittest. Production of the fittest, meaning the best fitted to the environment, become, of course, much, much more difficult. Should such a thing as cultural selection exist? Does it? I don't know. It's, a topic for discussion. I suppose it might be to do with a fit of some kind in terms of dominant fashions in ideas and groups. I mean, we certainly are aware of that. New ideas like interesting ecologies often come from the margins and the borders. There is a sort of logic at work there somehow. But once you start to think about this, I think you find yourself quite quickly entering the realms of philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, Kuhnian paradigms and stuff. It's a huge topic. And certainly you get into the question of shifts in knowledge and the thing that interested Peirce probably most of all, which is a general logic of development and growth. How does knowledge grow? How does science grow? Was one of the main things that he was interested in. So all this is indeed in the Peircean territory of the logics of change. And that question of the logics of change will take Peirce and us to both biological and cultural evolution. It'll take us to natural and cultural stories, to the organism as processual semiotic structuration of habits and differences, to the organism as made up of sign relations, and to the natural metaphors and metonymies before it takes us to the cultural ones. But before moving on to that, I want to pause for a moment to notice the changes that are going on in biology. I don't know how many of you were in Kalevi's paper yesterday, but he actually did a very neat account of those changes, which involve a move from the present, although Kalevi says it's happened before, from the modern Darwin, in our case, the modern Darwinian synthesis, sometimes known as the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which is associated with Julian Huxley and Theodosius Dobzhansky, J.B.S. Haldane, Ernst Mayr, and so on, and towards epigenetic accounts of development and evolution, so not governed by genes. The growth of developmental systems theory in particular has meant that biologists are much more likely now to talk about metaphors and stories than they were even 10 or 15 years ago. Even in the time that I've been involved thinking about biosemiotics, there's been a shift that I've noticed going on. Kalevi himself has noted the ways in which the grip of the modern synthesis has dug a vast trench between humanities' interests in language, semiosis and meaning-making, and similar interests in the life sciences. In his foreword to a very important book that I would dearly like to get my hands on, but it's quite expensive. I'm waiting for the British Library to get its act together on it. In his foreword to the recent English translation of Patrick Serriot's book, Structure and the Whole, East, West, and Non-Darwinian Biology in the Origins of Structural Linguistics, fantastic, a book, incidentally, which demonstrates a long history of the intertwining of ideas in linguistics, geography, borders, and biology. Kalevi writes, the modern synthesis in biology during the 1930s made from a set of Darwinian ideas an extraordinarily strong dominant, and it dug a trench between philology and the humanities and the study of other living and meaning-making creatures that was almost insurmountably wide. It temporarily killed the idea of intentionality in the life sciences. It almost excluded the idea of convergence. Baer, Berg, and their followers developed a sound non-Darwinian approach. Was this sometimes called the German synthesis? Do you know, Kalevi? I think it might have been, developed a non-Darwinian approach to the explanation of the means and forms of evolution. I'm still quoting from Kalevi's foreword to the Serio book. According to this approach, development explains evolution and not vice versa. Remarkably, the principles and means of this approach could be formulated in Jakobson's hands, Roman Jakobson's hands, as structuralism. Jakobson introduced this term into linguistics. So this is a very important book, and there's some really interesting research being done there. I've done a sort of bit on it in the essays that were put together to celebrate Jesper Hoffmeyer's 70th birthday, called A More Developed Sign. People have worked on this. Jakobson himself is very aware of the homological relationship between language and biology. But this is a very rich field. And of course, one has seen this gesture before. Darwin's development of the branching structure of evolution was influenced by his cousin Hensley Wedgwood's work on philological work on the evolution of languages. And Jakobson's importation of Prague school thinking into France eventually, structuralism, didn't manage to take this wider semiotic or biosemiotic and biological dimension across that border for various reasons. Anyway, research in epigenetics, the activity of prions in protein folding and not other non-genocentric mechanisms, means that it's becoming increasingly clear that DNA is not the only means of heritable change. Not only are epigenetic behaviours a source of evolution, but also in a surprising rebirth of a form of Lamarckism. This is just extraordinary. It appears that environmentally acquired traits, such as reactions to stress, can be heritable too. There's a woman called Susan Lindquist. If you Google Lindquist, Lindquist, and Lamarckism, I think, or perhaps neo-Lamarckism, you'll get a little sort of thing, a little video of her introducing this neo-Lamarckian work. So you can see, I mean, what I'm trying to indicate is the extent of changes in biology towards, of which biosemiotics is one, towards a sort of, and it will be revolutionary. The question of materialism and immaterialism is something else. That's a hurdle, I guess. But there are these huge changes going on. And of course, science is a part of culture, and it'll affect culture. It'll affect how people think about things. The question of heritable stress, so that, parents, and I've read a paper on this in somewhere like Nature or something. Sorry, I've forgotten to bring the actual reference. The idea that parents experiencing stress, long before they meet and have children, can generate stress-ridden children, of course, has huge cultural implications, doesn't it, and political implications. Anyway, to return now more directly to von Uexküll, the organism is not passive in evolutionary terms, just as we, in our very complicated human ways, shape our environment. So too do all other organisms. I think myself that everything that we do is there in nature before us. I mean, we do it in very complex ways because, our culture and articulate language is an emergent aspect of semiosis which precedes us and which belongs to all life. We shape our environment, so we shouldn't be surprised that all other organisms do too. And it's here we can introduce von Uexküll's second important contribution to biosemiotic thinking. This is the notion of the Funktionskreis, or functional circle. Making von Uexküll a very early proto-cybernetician, this describes the way in which signs from the Umwelt enter the Innenwelt, or inner world, of the organism, and thus change the organism's behaviour. I would say that they activate the organism's interpretive capacities, its mind. But of course, we don't have a language for talking about interpretation and mind in terms of other organisms. So we have to use these human words. And it means that we're stretching our language and we're stretching our concepts. Nonetheless, I think it's a very useful exercise to think in terms of non-human minds and to try and think through what that might imply about our own mind and our own sense of interpretation, of what interpretation means. At any rate, we can notice that signs flow inwards, round and about the organismic Innenwelt systems, and they're transformed by interpretations and translations, flow outward again as other signs. Does this require consciousness? No, clearly not. Sorry. Humans are the only animals that are deeply self-reflective. There's another thing that has come on in concert with this is biosemiotics and the realization that other animals all organisms have a sort of intentionality, but ethology has changed as well. And I don't feel competent to say to what extent animals have self-reflection, but they probably don't, I guess. It's certainly mainly a sort of intense self-reflection, anyways, mainly a human thing. Certainly we seem to be the only animals that are conscious of the fact that we use signs. So these effects, the effects of these changed signs circulating around in this cybernetic fashion, interpreted and transformed, are felt and in their turn translated in the Umwelten and Innenwelten of many other living things. Every creature, no matter how simple, must have a sense of aboutness or intentionality. Organisms have meanings and purposes and aims. However, system-derived and non-conscious, they're not machines. Every living thing must be capable of negotiating a sometimes surprising world. This means that every organism, as I've said, has something like mind. Mind doesn't require consciousness. Indeed, most of your minds and my mind, and certainly the most creative parts, are non-conscious. As research on creativity shows, consciousness is enormously powerful, very focused and limited. It's like a spotlight beam, isn't it? That's why if you're really immersed in something you're thinking hard about, you don't hear people talking to you. It's a very, very focused thing. But there's another level, and people have addressed this already at the conference, of which you're hearing, seeing, sensing things all the time in that kind of tacit way, associated with Michael Polanyi's work on tacit knowledge. Okay, so how am I doing? We can also notice that when signs enter an organism's Innenwelt, they enter a space in which, even from the start, it makes little sense to talk about body and mind as though these were two distinct things. A mind is the sense which an organism makes of the relations between itself and its Umwelt. And as Gregory Bateson pointed out, an early biosemiotic, I think we would say, mind is a no thing, he said. Mind is a no thing. It's relational and immaterial. Mind is a sign of the activity of sign relations. Thus, instead of talking about mind and body as two distinct things, it will make much more sense to talk about cybersemiotic or biocybernetic feedback loopings, a constant circulation of semiosic processes, which also result in other signs flowing back out into the environment again. Thus, our ecologies and worlds made of the ceaseless cybernetic looping flows of semiosis. And with this in mind, it's worth noting that what DNA encodes is not a detailed assembly plan, but something more like a set of signs or cues whose reading by the cell depends upon the successful achievement of sense-making at each antecedent stage. And in this, you'll surely recognise the germ of our own human practice of reading, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, building up meaning as we go. That's what goes on in organisms. In other words, meanings biological and cultural grow. The story is the thread through which we can trace all those transformations and that growing. Just let me have a think a minute, because I've just looked at my watch and seen that it's already 12:10. Okay, so well, I need to finish at past. Is that right? Semiotic matters are more extensively developed into a system by Charles Sanders Peirce. Not only does he pick up a semiotic way of thinking which had lain more or less dormant between the end of the Middle Ages and the second half of the 19th century when Peirce revived it, but he also developed an evolutionary semiotic whose movement through time as a triadic series of relations forming what Thomas Sebeok called the semiotic spiral does bear some similarities when you think about it, with both von Uexküll's Funktionskreis and the later ideas of cyberneticians such as Gregory Bateson. Peirce's understanding of the sign involves a triadic structure, more accurately, a triadic structuration. And I don't think, incidentally, that idea of structuration is absent from Jakobson either. A triadic structuration of evolving sign relations formed by an object, a representamen, and an interpretant. The object, whether thing or idea, note, is causally efficacious, whether a thing or an idea, but it's never fully known, not least because it exists in a world of incalculable relations, in which you simply couldn't number all the possible relations. This is Whitehead's thought, isn't it? Yes, so formed by an object, whether thing or idea, an interpretant, not simply the human interpretation, but for every organism, and the interpretant, which is not simply a human interpretation, although a human interpretation can be an interpretant, but is more broadly the difference or change brought about by the sign relation as a whole. And this is a mobile processual understanding of the sign, any of the three aspects of which are, have to be thought together, they're not separable, any of the three aspects of which is capable of occupying any of the three positions. And it's from this movement of a sort of spiral of relations that new learning, development and evolutionary growth can occur. Note that the outcome can be, and usually is, governed by habit. A habit is something a bit like a dead metaphor, a difference which no longer signifies, although it once did, a difference which no longer signifies in its fullness. Bateson has this phrase, information is a difference which makes a difference. That's why I'm using the term difference. I'm also using it because similarity and difference are what make metaphor, as you'll know, work. So it is, so to speak, habit is a change or difference which doesn't make much difference. But clearly, life and communication depends upon regularities or habits. It's when the change or difference occurs which does make a real difference that we have real growth. This kind of difference is the result of something like a living metaphor, and I notice that that is the French title of Ricoeur's book on metaphor, translated into English as The Rule of Metaphor, but in French it's living metaphor. So this kind of difference is the result of something like a living metaphor in which the framing suppositions of the representamen are seen to be similar to another different kind of frame entirely. This collision between two frames, or perhaps we could say blending, following George Lakoff's work, conceptual blending, is a difference that really does make a difference. There's something new there. There's a bit of similarity. There's enough similarity to bear the idea, and there's a difference, and it's the difference that makes the metaphor work, makes the metaphor meaningful. These kinds of differences are dependent on a kind of logic of chance and guessing that Peirce called abduction, and it provides the potential for real growth when we're being creative, whether as artists, readers, scientists, whatever. We're abducting those abductive ideas. You'll all be familiar with this. They just come out of nowhere, don't they? That's not to say that you don't have to work hard. You do. You've got to fill your mind with a lot of furniture, and chance favours the well-prepared mind, etc., etc. But that's what Peirce means. It's a kind of guessing that so often, he says, it's quite weird, it's so often right. Now then, just a minute. I made myself cut this down so severely you wouldn't believe it, and I've still got too much. So, I did want to say something about literature. So there's an idea of development. The other person that I think has made a really useful contribution here is biosemiotician Jesper Hoffmeyer with his notion of semiotic scaffolding. And I think I'll just quote you from his essay here. Hoffmeyer writes, organic life processes at all levels, from the genetic to the behavioural, are coordinated by semiotic interactions between cells, tissues, membranes, organs, or individuals, and tuned through evolution to stabilise important functions. A system of semiotic scaffolding is dynamically very different from the concept of control by which biologists have explained functional stability in organisms. To take just one example, genes do not control the life of organisms, they scaffold it, meaning that the nature-nurture dynamics is far more complex and open than is often claimed. Contrary to physically based interactions, semiotic interactions do not depend on any direct causal connection, he means material, direct material causal connection between the sign vehicle, the representamen, and the effect. Semiotic interaction patterns therefore provide fast and versatile mechanisms for adaptations, mechanisms that depend on communication and learning rather than on genetic preformation. So we're thinking of evolutionary systems as learning systems, and you will know, you'll be able to get a grasp on what Hoffmeyer means by semiotic scaffolding if you think of your own experience of learning. You know, that sense that you have that it takes time, it's a process, it's not that somebody's poured something into you and you've got it. you have a sense that you get bits of it, and that scaffold, when you've got that bit of it, that bit of scaffold, that makes you able to, oh yes, I can build the next bit. And that's what he means, and it's a learning process that occurs not only in you as a part of evolution, but in all other organisms. So, in the final section, I want to look now at the role played by chance in a necessarily habit-run but not deterministic world. And I want to do that by ending with a brief consideration of creative practice and of poets in particular, because I think this tells us something significant about the conduct of life and the limits of the will as a source of creativity and adaptation more generally. So my first example, does that say the darkling thrush? It does. Is Thomas Hardy's The Darkling Thrush. It's a well-known poem, and I hope that you're familiar with it. The story the poem tells is of the poet's chance, wintry meeting with an aged thrush, which was nonetheless surprisingly capable of a Christmas birth of newness in its carolling in of the new year and the new 20th century. The poem was first published at Christmas 1899. We might say that the thrush and what it can mean is a chance affordance. It provides a kind of scaffolding for Hardy, which can make a bridge into the future. Peirce called this aspect of evolutionary life tychism, after the Greek for chance, tyche. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The creative use of chance by the individual, but necessarily drawn from and working for the community of being of which the individual is a part, is a characteristic of the play between habit and chance event, which makes all evolutionary life, biological and cultural, possible. Peirce called this principle of connectedness, in this very reminiscent of Whitehead, agapism. It links every evolutionary event in the universe in a play of semiotic patterns and exchange, and it's what Martin Heidegger called the mirror play of the simple onefold of earth and sky, divinities and mortals. In our modern period, Heidegger thought that this interrelatedness of things, a proper thinking of being as relation, had been forgotten, except by the poets. That's why he said that it was the poet's task to reach into the, what was it, he talked about a desolate time, that's right, and sort of a sort of midnight time in which the poet had to reach into the abyss, to drag meaning and meaning as relatedness out again. So the poet's job is to use the habit, the poet's job is the use of habit as formal constraint, as carrying vehicle for the unsettling of habit by difference. And this unsettling of habit has a processual temporal dimension also. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's argument that the past in memory is essentially creative and constructive in the present is another exemplary case of non-linear looping semiotic causation. And as you'll all know, of course, a very similar idea is expressed by T.S. Eliot in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, and in biology by the idea of downward causation, where subsequent developments rearrange or alter antecedent ones. To be overwhelmed by habit and to fail to see that both nature and culture are lived as acts of something like imaginative mind, creatively open to chance, is to be too caught in that degraded form of imagination that Coleridge calls fancy. This is, he says, the lethargy of custom, the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude. And as Owen Barfield writes in What Coleridge Thought, in this condition, the mind is enthralled to the lethargy of custom when it feeds solely on images which it itself has taken no part in producing. This, it seems to me, is a crucial part of what the humanities do. Here, too, creativity is recognised by Coleridge as the necessary counterpart to necessary habit. I'm not saying that habit you can do without habit. Obviously, habit is necessary. We couldn't communicate without it. We rely on all sorts of conventions. It's also worth noticing that for Coleridge, properly creative being is fundamentally relational. He writes, imagination is, and fancy is not, the very power of growth and production. Returning to Hardy's poem, we can note the parallels in the way the poet's new insight draws upon antecedent articulations also. The Christian imagery of midwinter is there, the the description of the thrushes singing as evensong, etc., etc., the whole idea of the birth of hope. But so too are earlier pagan hisses, tree worship and animism, the whispers and clicks of wind, water and earth meeting. The poem is full of sibilant sounds meeting the resistant consonants of soil and stone. I think it must have been raining or sleeting, certainly windy, when Hardy was out walking that day. These take the auditory imagination of both writer and reader back to the fabric of much earlier biosemiotic scaffoldings. Here's Eliot's famous formulation. What I call the auditory imagination is the feeling for syllable and rhythm, penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, sinking to the most primitive and forgotten, returning to the origin and bringing something back, seeking the beginning and the end. It works through meanings, certainly, or not without meanings in the ordinary sense, and fuses the old and obliterated and the trite, the current and the new and surprising, the most ancient and the most civilized mentality. It's as if poets reporting, and it's not only poets, actually scientists too, but poets, because they think about language so much, reporting a kind of sinking down into layers, deep kind of layers. Seamus Heaney's essay, Englands of the Mind, pursues Eliot's insight in order to explore what Heaney calls the deposits in the descending stories, that's with an E, of the literary and historical past. His examples come from the poetry of Ted Hughes, Geoffrey Hill, and Philip Larkin. There, Hughes's, this is Heaney, Hughes's is a primeval landscape where stones cry out and horizons endure, where the elements inhabit the mind with a religious force, where the pebble dreams, it is the fetus of God. Hill's poems, on the other hand, bear the mark of the Norman invasion. Heaney says, his elegies are not laments for the irrevocable dispersal of the comitatus and the ring-giver in the hall, but solemn requiems for Plantagenet kings. Larkin, nearer to the surface of the present, speaks in a language, Heaney says, where trees and flowers and grasses are neither animistic nor hallowed by half-remembered druidic lore. They are the emblems of mutability. Behind them lies the sensibility of troubadour and courtier. But we can reach deeper still, down those sort of inverted stories or those biosemiotic layers, as I think of them. E.A. Haussmann notes that poetry seems to him more physical than intellectual, and going even deeper, of course, into the cellars and foundations of the biosemiotic self. Here's D.H. Lawrence writing on feelings expressed in the writing and reading of the novel, especially in its characters. He says, man is the only creature who has deliberately tried to tame himself. Now we have to return. Now again the old Adam must lift up his face and his breast and untame himself. In the very darkest continent of the body there is God, and from him issues the first dark rays of our feeling, wordless and utterly previous to words, the innermost rays, the first messengers, the primeval, honourable beasts of our being, whose voice echoes wordless and forever wordless down the darkest avenues of the soul, but full of potent speech, our own inner meaning. Now we have to educate ourselves by listening, not by listening into noises from Chicago to Timbuktu, but listening into the voices of the honourable beasts that call in the dark paths of the veins of our body, from the God in the heart, listening inwards, not for words nor for inspiration, but to the lowing of the innermost beasts, the feelings that roam in the forest of the blood from the feet of God within the red, dark heart. Finally, when we want to think about a description of proper living thought coming in, we can turn to a well-known example, which is Ted Hughes's poem, The Thought Fox, which describes the process as a kind of abductive animal canniness. The poem starts with loneliness, quiet, a starless midnight forest, a ticking clock, the poet's blank page. Beyond the consonants of earth and forest, hacking and hedging and hammering down, there comes fluid and voweling and sibilant, that shockingly midnight urgent, something else is alive. I imagine this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness and this blank page where my fingers move. And then comes the quickening. Through the window I see no star. Something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Till, with a sudden sharp stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still. The clock ticks. The page is printed. The poetic voice is made in the magical den of the mind, where animal meaning lives. The middle stanzas tell us something about the nature of the thought fox. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. Two eyes serve a movement that now, and again, now, and now, and now, sets neat prints into the snow. Between trees and warily, a lame shadow lags by stump, and in hollow of a body that is bold to come. Across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly, coming about its own business. We can see that this is a creature of poiesis, constantly on the lookout for signs, a maker of meanings, but also Hughes's anima is, as with the lively source of so many inventions, particularly aesthetic ones, a creature of chance, a wily and opportunistic fox. Nothing must be approached directly or willed. There is no meaning in the chance event itself. Meaning is made from the ceaseless play of a mind that is a connoisseur of magical coincidence and determined to make something out of it. Supposedly modern, rational and scientifically educated people often ask with great frustration why so many people remain superstitious and engaged in magical thinking. The right answer is not because they are stupid or insufficiently educated in science. It's because that, mysteriously and magically, is how the human mind works. It's capable of taking what seems to be a small hint or clue, a chance from a chance event, and of building from it, via the mind's vast web of connections, a hypothesis about what this new thing might mean, about what it might be associated with, and about what its implications might be. The necessary structure of the sign, regardless of there being any minds in actual existence, describes the structure necessary to any mind also. In other words, mind is a sign. It is open, unfinished, and capable of growth. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that mind is as many potential billions of sign relations as there are grains of sand in the whole wide world. That's it. Okay.
Thank you so much. We have possibility for questions and comments.
You mentioned Lynn Markellis, and I always wondered when I was reading her work and yours and other biosemiotics whether there is any link between symbiogenesis and biosemiotics. You also mentioned symbiogenesis in your work, biosemiotic work. But is there any, can you expand on that a bit, please? In symbiogenesis.
Sorry, Serpil, I'm not quite getting your question. Symbiogenesis?
Yes. Sorry for my pronunciation.
No, it's fine, I'm just not hearing you very well. And you're asking me...
Yeah, have you ever looked at that from a biosemiotic perspective?
Yeah. I think in The Whole Creature that I said that I thought that it was a sort of... Margulis you mentioned, didn't you? Yeah. Yes, very important, sort of scoffed at for years, and now absolutely accepted. Margulis argued that an important source of development was symbiogenesis, in which organisms, very simple organisms, I think she says, she calls what they do failed eating, I think. So you try and eat somebody else, and then you discover that they're sort of stuck, and then you think, but I quite like it, really. And these two organisms begin to live together. And I think I said in The Whole Creature that I thought it was a sort of, perhaps a very primitive form of metaphor, that similarity. They're similar enough that they can live, they can be in a relation, whether it's predator prey
and they produce a third organism. Two organisms come together, they're mutually, they're different,
Well, I obviously can be sexual, but not necessarily, I think. And thinking of the illustrations from her book, she's got one organism entering another organism, But she's also got another illustration, which is of something that was thought to be a single organism. I think was actually made up of loads of microorganisms. So it's not necessarily just two. It can go on. But I did think about it as potentially a source of this. I mean, it seems to me that the relationship, that the question of similarity, habit, repetition, and on the one hand, and difference, occasioned by chance, is fundamental. It seems to me that's absolutely sort of fundamental relation. So when I read that Margulis on symbiosis and symbiogenesis, I certainly thought, yeah, it's a relation of similarity and difference. There's enough similarity for those two organisms to be in relation, even if it's a predator-prey relation. And there's enough difference for it to generate something new, which is a multi-celled organism. Is that what you were asking? Yes.
That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have a question. You early on in your talk, you referred to the notion of autopoiesis, and you talked about the autopoiesis and the self-reading text. And that's autopoiesis is an idea that I'm very interested in, but it seemed to me to run kind of counter in some ways to the drift of your larger argument, because with autopoiesis, I think the main point seems to be that sort of an organism has to make some kind of cut between itself and the environment that sort of that can no longer be crossed, and that in a sense the ability of an organism to refer to its environment and to create representations of the environment depends on it being in some sense fundamentally, on this sort of closure. So in a sense, it's a possibility of being open towards the environment depends on closure, this idea of openness from closure. And I wonder, and I think this is linked to a criticism that has been made of Gregory Bateson, that he kind of didn't really distinguish between mind and communication. With him, mind and communication kind of are a blur. And I think one thing that you can do with the theory of autopoiesis is to say, well, you need to make that distinction between mind and communication and think of both of them as autopoietic. I wonder, could you just comment how that idea of autopoiesis functions in your view of biosemiotics?
Well, I don't think that the closed system is ever completely closed. It's a semi-permeable membrane, and it's crossed by semiosis, it's crossed by relation. So I wonder who you're thinking of. Are you thinking of Luhmann? Yeah. I don't think it's right to talk about it being. I mean, it's closed to some extent, but it's obviously not closed, is it? In order for there to be a self, there has to be a membrane. That's the original or the originary distinction, isn't it, between, the thing that would create a sense of aboutness, a sense of intentionality, would be the need to negotiate between self and Umwelt, or between Innenwelt and Umwelt. But I mean, I've never understood why he talks about it being closed in that way. I don't think it is closed. It's a semi-permeable membrane. I mean, I just don't get it, Maybe I haven't read him well enough, but I don't get it at all. It seems to me that it's crossed by signs, and that our ordinary life as organisms tells us, as organisms. The cellular membrane is actually, for a cell, is like its brain, in fact. It's where the outside world affects it, and it takes information from. So I don't know about I haven't read any of those criticisms that you're talking about Bateson. I mean, I think for myself that there's a question Bateson is inclined to talk about, as I think might be Eduardo Cohn with the What Forests Think book, which I haven't read yet, inclined to talk about ecologies as a sort of mind. I mean, Bateson seems to do that, doesn't he? And I'm not sure what I really think about that. I want to sort of think a bit more about it, because generally speaking, I think that there has to be a membrane, there has to be some form of closure, but that it's always semi-permeable. How could it not be? How could it not be?
The point of the membrane being that it completely excludes certain things, and if it didn't, then the organism would break down. So that certain things can't cross without destroying the organism.
Yes, and so, yes, that's true.
I just wondered whether autopoiesis is sort of a term. I'm sorry. Whether autopoiesis is a term that you sort of use that's kind of systematically a part of that's systematically integrated in your view of biosemiosis.
Well, I think actually, Kalevi could probably talk to you more effectively about the biology of this, but I do think that he's right when he says that the organism is a self-reading text. Its use of semiosis is how it makes itself, and that's what you get in, as I understand it, in the unfolding of development, of an organism from a single cell itself. All those stages are involve a sort of self-reflexive, if one can talk about that, the language is always a bit difficult, reading of its own processes in order to then move on to the next stage. And in that sense, it is self-creating. But it's always with reference to, obviously, with reference to its Umwelten, isn't it? I mean, its Innenwelten processes are in constant dialogue with Umwelten semiotic processes. Does that not answer your question?
It's a paradox. You end up with a paradox that the capability of the organism to refer to its environment is a function of its capability of referring to itself.
Yes.
And it always has to do both at the same time.
Yes.
It can never refer to the environment without referring to itself.
Yes. Can you? If that's what you do, then I don't think you should think there's a problem with other organisms doing it. And it is what you do.
Thanks a lot for your talk. My question is about probably one of the things that got cut out in your trying to stick with the time. The title was The Carrying. And I was quite interested in what you meant by that in terms of carrying on, carrying across, carrying along, carrying capacity. It's a very evocative term, and I was wondering whether you could maybe spare a few words on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I did. I think I managed to mention it once, didn't I? I think of... so it's part of this theme of material being and immaterial relations and their bound upness with one another. I think of matter as a carrier, a bearer of semiotic relations, which is also clearly changed by those relations. So I'm really trying to emphasize the extent to which we need to think about the immateriality of sign relations and the materiality of matter together. And that's why I use the phrase. I mean, it's true that I did actually change what I was going to do from when I gave the title a long time ago. So the emphasis shifted a bit. But that's what I meant. I meant that I was trying to think of a way for us to think about that, what I suggested at the beginning is a sort of relatively revolutionary kind of thought that we have to take immaterial things seriously. I mean, one of the strange things about this whole thing is weird, and I think, one is tempted to think about it as oneself as witnessing the power of ideology, is that we all take semiotic immaterial relations and semiotic causality utterly seriously. A person's thoughts can start a war, but thoughts mustn't be confused with their emergent. Mind is clearly an emergent aspect of brain. It's not the same thing. The brain is the material carrier. Well, the brain, the body, and the environment, I should say, are the material carriers of immaterial relations. And that's why I started with those quotes and with the Lewontin quote about the a priori commitment to materialism. That's why Thomas Nagel wrote his book. And a world-famous philosopher, much respected, got absolutely pilloried for saying, oh, look, the emperor might not have any clothes on. But the thing that's a puzzle is we all do it all the time. If you speak English and somebody gets up in this room and shouts fire, you'll get out of the room. You'll get out of the building. That's semiotic causation. What is it? It needs codes and channels. It needs the voice and the ear and all that kind of thing. But if somebody said the same thing to you in Finnish or Estonian, it wouldn't have the same effect. It's because you wouldn't be able to read it. And reading is a semiotic. You wouldn't be able to understand it. Understanding is a semiotic. It's a question of semiotic understanding and semiotic causation. But you can say that to people and they go, meh, But actually, and that's what Nagel was saying. That's really all he was saying. There are things, immaterial things that we have to take seriously, and we're not taking them seriously. That will really shift us if we start to do that.
Thanks. I was actually thinking a little bit further about Umwelt. When you briefly defined it, you said that basically each species perceives things in its Umwelt that are that are necessary for its survival and multiplying. And I was kind of wondering, is that the whole story?
Yeah, no, I think it probably isn't, actually.
And if not, then is it... there might be many perceptions that we or some other organisms do not actively need for survival, or we don't know that we need them. But is it the place where the possibilities for the unexpected creative opportunities for something new to emerge come up?
That's a really good question. I think it probably isn't. And I think there are places where you say something and you sort of think it's probably not quite true. And you just sort of put it down as something you're going to have to think about more. And that's what I think about that. I think, there are, like around the question of survival of the fittest, selection, natural selection. There's a lot of stuff now on the possibility of social selection or, different kinds of selectionist sort of forces. And I think it's right. I think that's probably hideously narrow. But I haven't thought about it enough yet, although I'm trying to think about it, to be able to sort of talk about it in any length. But it's a good question. It's the right question to ask, I think. Sorry, I can't say more.
Is it me now? Wendy, I'm slightly haunted by a question that was asked after Timo's paper yesterday, which is how can what we're calling biosemiotic criticism actually be a literary criticism that makes judgments of whether a poem or any kind of work of art or writing is good or not. And it seemed to me that your account of the relationship between habit and innovative disruption of some kind seemed to be reaching towards an account of what more traditionally is called creative originality.
Yeah.
And yet that word originality might bring some problems with it as well in terms of what you're saying. And I suppose another way of asking the question is to ask, in terms of what you're doing with these two poems, The Darkling Thrush and The Thought Fox, they both seem to be in some sense poems in which the accustomed thinking of the persona, the speaker, is interrupted by a visitation by an animal or an imaginary animal. Operating as a sort of muse, even though in other ways they are quite, in a sense, familiar sorts of poems, quite strongly conventional poems. So, how can your way of thinking give us some critical criteria for, in a sense, judging how good those poems are?
Okay, well, thanks for that question. My answer there would be to go to Peirce's notion, of that evolutionary notion, of the growth of organisms being like, he says it explicitly, being the growth of ideas. Ideas are like organisms, he says, and that's not, he says in a strict sense, I'm not using that as a figure of speech. So my answer would be something like, does the writing engender new thought for the reader? Does it do some of that thing which I think is the writer's task, or the thinker's task too, actually, which is to unsettle things in a productive way, not not just to, crash around in a kind of let's just sort of smash everything up because then something revolutionary will happen, a sort of way. But is the writing capable of generating interesting new thought? And that is a question, of course, for the community, isn't it? You make your interpretation, you say what you have to say. And it's a question of whether the community picks it up or not, So that would be that's the way that I would think about that, the value of the unsettling of... I don't want, as I said before, I don't want to suggest that habit is a bad thing. Habit is necessary, but it must be possible to upset it. What I worry about, when I think about it, I tend to think about politics, actually. I think about the dangers of creedal things, of belief systems that have just become sclerotic, and you're not allowed to upset them, and the borders, the interesting places, are sort of marginalised and all that sort of thing. Obviously I think about it in terms of education quite a lot, and what's happening to us all, clearly, from the Dean's introduction here to our own experience in the UK of the research exercise. There's some terrible sclerotic thing, there's sort of horrendous habits of mind that need upsetting. But that would be my sort of answer. Does it make people argue even? If it makes people argue, it's good. If people are engaging with it, it's good.
That is a kind of survival of the fittest then, isn't it?
Well, but it might be, I suppose, but your definition of the fittest would be the most what? The most...
Well, that which happens to engage with its environment, that is to say, its receptive readers, in such a way as somehow to make connections with them that stimulate argument.
Yes.
That's what you're suggesting, which of course might be, in a way, a rather chancy business. It might misfire or it might not.
Absolutely. It is a chancy business.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's what, you know, the panel this morning was clearly talking about, you know, something that would make us go, oh, that's interesting. I can think about something that I thought about along those tram lines. I can suddenly think about it differently, you know. And it is a chancy business, absolutely is, yeah.
I'd like to add a small comment on this topic. So I feel I like to read one of your messages as a suggestion to biologists to read more poetry.
Yes.
So in a way that, namely that poetic way of expression might be useful also for sort of a more scientifically deep way to convey the understanding of other minds.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, that's part of the work that I hope my own work will do. You know, we're all very concerned about the idea that biosemiotics is interdisciplinary, and that means it has to go both ways. You know, I mean, I've strained my poor little noddle, you know, hard enough with biology. So, you know, some biologists could strain their little noddles with some poetry. I think that's right, and I think it would be helpful.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm curious about understanding consciousness over here. Thank you. I'm curious about understanding consciousness as an emergent phenomenon in the history of life. I think if you take it back to the beginnings, that you can see that semiotic freedom, in Hofmeier's terms, is increasing over time. What do you think the implications are of that, and will it continue indefinitely? Thank you.
So a small question then. Well, you know, just because something is natural and evolves doesn't mean it's good. That's one thing I'd say. All sorts of things can happen. It depends on the semiotic scaffolding that a culture is engaged in its kind of its dominant ideas, I suppose. And then you get what Stuart Kauffman really helpfully calls the notion of the adjacent possible. So, I mean, in one sense, you could say that, you know, the development of technology is natural. It's natural, but it includes kinds of. You can see that it's an extension of semiotic freedom in some senses, can't you? You know, people can communicate much more easily. We have, you know, we're all conscious of all those sorts of what's going on in, you know, well, in Turkey and Iran and various sorts of places where people are using mobile and technology and social media to communicate with each other in important ways. And that, you know, you'd want to talk about that in terms of semiotic, in terms of Hofmeier's phrase, semiotic freedom. But equally, we can all talk about, and frequently do, our anxieties about the sort of downside to it. So, I mean, you know, it's really hard, isn't it, to predict, if we're just thinking about that, you know, the development of tools, all sorts of things can happen. I mean, you know, who can... The only thing that I could say with any certainty is that all the big predictions made about the future are never right. They're hardly ever right, which is a weird thing in itself. It's a huge question, isn't it? You know, I mean, I can possibly...
Thank you very much.
Say yes.
Thank you very much. Now we have used our time, and before we end, Timo will have some technical words. But thank you very much again.